The hum of the server racks was the only lullaby Thomas knew in these late hours, a constant, low thrum against the backdrop of the city's distant breath. My world, usually a pristine canvas of balanced ledgers and reconciled statements, stretched before me, illuminated by the cool glow of a dozen monitors. Each pixel, a shard of data, each sum, a testament to order. I was the silent sentinel of the firm's financial purity, a weaver of intricate numerical tapestries, and tonight the threads felt frayed. A single cup of cooling tea forgotten beside a stack of audit reports bore witness to my vigil. My fingers, accustomed to the rhythmic dance across a keyboard, paused over a particular entry. Client, Aethelred Global Ventures, high profile, prestigious, a beacon of the firm's success. And yet something in the latest quarterly review snagged at the meticulous netting of my perception. It was a whisper at first, a discrepancy so minute, so perfectly camouflaged within a cascade of legitimate transactions, that another eye might have dismissed it as a rounding error, a digital phantom. A shipment of specialized industrial components, valued at an amount that, while substantial, deviated by a fraction of a percent from its historical cost-plus markup. Not enough to trigger an alert, not enough to raise a flag in the automated systems, but enough to stir the quiet disquiet in my own finely tuned algorithms. My mind, a complex engine of cross-referencing and pattern recognition, began its work. I pulled up the previous quarter's data, then the one before that. The deviation persisted, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in the bedrock of the client's accounts. Like a single off-key note in a symphony, it was easily missed, but once heard, it could not be unheard. "No," I murmured, the sound swallowed by the cavernous office. My brow furrowed, a crease of concentration deepening between my eyes. This wasn't a glitch in the software. This was a glitch in the logic. My internal compass, usually steadfast, quivered. I felt a prickle of something akin to self-doubt. Had I finally, after years of unwavering precision, made an error in my own assessment? They was my mind, stretched thin by these solitary hours, conjuring phantoms from the data streams. I pushed the thought away, a fleeting shadow. The numbers were immutable. They did not lie, but they could certainly be made to obscure. I delved deeper, navigating through layers of digital manifests, invoices, and customs declarations. The trail was a labyrinth, each pathway meticulously constructed to appear legitimate. The specific item that first caught my attention, the industrial components, was part of a larger chain of transactions, all linked to imports and exports. I began to track the flow not just of money but of goods. This was where the phantom truly began to take form. A series of inbound shipments, all declared at slightly undervalued rates, passed through various ports of entry. Most were large, bustling hubs expected for Aethelred's scale. But then a flicker, an outlier, a particular consignment not of components, but of a far less tangible service, consulting fees for logistical oversight, was tied to an import record that listed its point of entry as a small airport customs late flight. The phrase hung in the air, luminous on my screen, a discordant note in the carefully orchestrated financial score. A small airport, late flight, for logistical oversight consulting. It was an oddity, a piece that didn't fit the grand puzzle. Why such a specific, almost furtive, detail for a seemingly innocuous service? And why would a company of Aethelred's stature use such a route for something that could be handled via secure digital transfer or a standard commercial flight? I cross-referenced the consulting fees against the actual shipping manifests. There was no corresponding physical shipment for that specific entry. The money moved, the service was billed, but no tangible goods arrived or departed through that particular channel. It was a ghost transaction, a financial wraith. My heart began a slow, deliberate drumbeat against my ribs. This wasn't an accounting error. It was a systemic anomaly, a deliberate act of financial legerdemain. The minor discrepancies, the undervalued goods, the phantom consulting fees tied to an obscure point of entry, they weren't isolated incidents. The air in the office grew heavy, pressing in on me. The server's hum seemed to deepen into a growl. This wasn't merely creative accounting. This was a carefully constructed illusion, a shell game played with millions, perhaps billions. I zoomed out, examining the wider pattern. The undervalued imports created a pool of undeclared funds. The consulting fees at the small airport, late flight, served as a conduit, a phantom gateway for these funds to move out of the country or perhaps to be laundered back in, disguised as legitimate income. The sheer volume of these seemingly insignificant deviations when aggregated was staggering. My screen, usually a kaleidoscope of green and black, now pulsed with a silent crimson warning. This wasn't just a glitch. This was a sophisticated apparatus, an intricate web spun by hands that understood the nuances of finance as intimately as I did, but used that knowledge to unravel the very fabric of legality. Money laundering, on an international scale, and it was happening right under the firm's prestigious roof, cloaked in the impeccable reputation of Aethelred Global Ventures. I was alone with this terrible knowledge. The weight of it settled on my shoulders, a sudden, crushing burden. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to hit save, to document this discovery, to bring it to the attention of my superiors. If this was so expertly hidden, so deeply embedded, what did that say about the hands that pulled the strings? And what would happen to the messenger who dared to expose the truth? The precise, ordered world I inhabited had just dissolved into a chaotic, dangerous unknown. The numbers had spoken, and their message was a warning. The cool glow of a dozen monitors still painted the periphery of my vision, even as I stepped away from the server racks. My discovery, a knot of transactions so cleverly disguised it shimmered with its own dark artistry, pulsed behind my eyes. It was a phantom limb of knowledge, painful in its truth, demanding to be acknowledged. I had traced the currents, followed the digital breadcrumbs through shell corporations and offshore havens, until the pattern coalesced into an undeniable, monstrous shape. A money laundering scheme of staggering scale, far beyond mere corporate fraud. My initial instinct, honed by years of ethical practice, was a pure, unblemished call to action. This wasn't a matter for quiet adjustment or internal memo. This was a criminal enterprise, a cancer metastasizing within the very financial arteries I was sworn to protect. The firm, I thought, would want to know. They needed to know. The next morning, the polished chrome and hushed luxury of the senior partner's office felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. Sunlight, filtered through vertical blinds, striped the Persian rug as I laid out my findings. My voice, usually a calm instrument of fact, held an edge of urgency I couldn't quite suppress. I presented the flowcharts, the highlighted discrepancies, the suspicious wire transfers, a narrative woven from numbers, pointing directly to a known international crime syndicate, its tendrils reaching into the very heart of our client roster. The senior partner, a man whose silver hair and tailored suits exuded an aura of impeccable authority, listened with a serene, almost detached patience. His gaze, usually sharp and penetrating, seemed to drift over my meticulously prepared binders, settling instead on the cityscape outside his window. "Thomas," he began, his tone a smooth, unhurried stream, "I appreciate your diligence, truly. Your attention to detail is as ever exemplary." He paused, a beat too long, letting the words hang in the air like an unlit fuse. "However, these are complex waters you're navigating. International finance, particularly at this level, often presents what appear to be anomalies to the uninitiated." My jaw tightened. "Uninitiated, sir. I believe I've followed the audit trail to its logical conclusion. The shell companies, the sudden influx of capital from unregistered entities, the consistent routing through specific high-risk jurisdictions, it's not anomalous. It's a pattern, a deliberate one." He finally turned, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. A pattern, perhaps, or merely the intricate dance of global capital seeking optimal pathways. Sometimes, Thomas, the most straightforward explanation isn't always the most accurate. Sometimes, what appears to be a flaw is merely a feature of a system far grander than our immediate purview. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. An overzealous pursuit of such patterns, especially when they touch upon our more sensitive clients, can be perceived as disruptive. It can have unforeseen consequences not just for the firm but for one's own trajectory within it. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. The words themselves were soft, but their undertone was a sharp, metallic tang of warning. My trajectory. The implication was clear. Look too closely and my career, my carefully constructed life, could derail. It wasn't a threat, not overtly, but it was a chillingly effective suggestion. My stomach churned. This wasn't the response I'd expected. He simply steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. I am suggesting, Thomas, that you exercise discretion, that you allow the firm to handle these intricacies. There are many ways to contribute. Perhaps a reassignment to a less contentious portfolio would be beneficial for all involved. I left his office with the binders still clutched in my hand, their weight now feeling like a burden, not a shield of truth. The polished floors of the firm, usually a source of quiet pride, now felt like a slippery slope. The senior partner hadn't just downplayed my concerns. He had implicitly warned me off, revealing a rot that reached far higher than I had dared to imagine. The firm wasn't just unknowingly facilitating. It was actively, subtly protecting. The next few days were a blur of internal re-strategizing. I couldn't trust my superiors. The very people I was supposed to report to were either compromised or complicit. My investigation, once official, now had to go underground. If they wouldn't listen, I would gather undeniable proof. My new lead, a faint whisper in the digital wind, pointed to a specific individual, an intermediary whose travel records intersected with some of the most opaque transactions I'd uncovered. A late-night flight, an arrival from a country known for its lax financial oversight into a small regional hub. It was a long shot, a desperate thread I pulled, hoping it wouldn't snap. It was close to midnight when I pulled into the desolate parking lot of the small airport customs, late flight. I kept to the periphery, my coat collar pulled high, my eyes scanning the weary faces emerging from the arrival gate. Each passenger carried the fatigue of travel, but I was looking for something else, a particular set of features, a specific nervous energy I'd gleaned from fragmented reports and a grainy, decade-old photograph. The air was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and disinfectant. A young customs officer, his uniform crisp despite the hour, exchanged desultory words with a departing passenger. My gaze, however, was fixed on the gate. Then I saw him. A man of medium height, nondescript in every way save for the expensive, slightly rumpled suit and a briefcase clutched with an almost desperate grip. His eyes darted around, betraying a flicker of apprehension that others, less attuned to the nuances of guilt, might have missed. He presented his papers, spoke briefly, and then with a nod from the officer moved towards the exit. My heart quickened. This was the man, the one whose name had appeared, a ghost in the machine, across those tainted ledgers. I watched him collect a single piece of luggage, a small carry-on, before disappearing through the automatic doors. My breath caught in my throat. I had found a piece of the puzzle, but the full picture remained agonizingly out of reach. What was in that briefcase? The questions gnawed at me, a relentless, hungry beast. The senior partner's words, heavy as lead, still echoed in the polished expanse of my memory. Some truths are best left undisturbed, Thomas. He had not merely advised, he had warned, a silken cord tightening around my throat, unseen but felt. The binders, once a shield of irrefutable fact, now felt like an anchor dragging me into murky depths. The firm, my sanctuary of order and logic, had revealed a hidden maw, ready to swallow inconvenient truths whole. My initial attempts at reporting, a cautious unfurling of red flags, had been met with a wall of practiced nonchalance, then the subtle, chilling pressure of dismissal. They wanted me to forget, to fold the tapestry of corruption back into the shadows. But the threads, once seen, could not be unseen. They pulsed with an ugly vitality demanding attention. My conscience, a stubborn compass, spun wildly, pointing not towards safety but towards the storm. I could not simply walk away. Each digit, each misplaced comma, a silent scream. So I began to work in the liminal spaces, the hushed hours before dawn and the quiet exhaustion after midnight. My home office, usually a haven of domesticity, transformed into a clandestine command center. A new, encrypted laptop, purchased with cash from a nondescript electronics outlet, hummed with a conspiratorial glow. I revisited the binders, not with the firm's protocols as my guide, but with a fresh, untainted suspicion. I peeled back layers of legitimate transactions, searching for the telltale shimmer of artifice. My fingers, usually dancing across spreadsheets with elegant precision, now moved with a hunter's stealth. The initial patterns, once vague, began to sharpen. A series of wire transfers, unusually large and frequent, consistently flowed into a seemingly innocuous logistics company, Global Reach Freight Solutions. Their listed services were mundane cargo handling, warehousing, customs brokerage. Yet their financial footprint was anything but. They seemed to handle an extraordinary volume for their modest public profile. I began to cross-reference these transfers with international shipping manifests, publicly available but requiring a meticulous eye to decipher. The firm's network, once my pride, was now a dangerous landscape. I accessed the data through proxies, weaving a digital veil around my inquiries, a ghost in the machine. Days bled into nights, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a growing knot of apprehension in my stomach. The world outside my window, once a comforting backdrop, now felt distant, irrelevant to the labyrinth I was constructing. The pieces began to coalesce around a particular route, a weekly cargo flight always late, always destined for a small regional hub. A hub I hadn't initially paid much attention to. The sheer volume of high-value goods, electronics, luxury textiles, even rare earth minerals declared on these manifests, all handled by Global Reach Freight Solutions, was disproportionate for such a modest airport. It was a detail too neat, too perfectly balanced, like a ledger entry that screamed of deliberate manipulation. My intuition, honed over years of dissecting financial lies, prickled. This wasn't just about moving money. It was about moving something else that money facilitated. The goods themselves were a smokescreen or perhaps a conduit. This was about power, about control, about a web of influence that stretched far beyond the sterile confines of balance sheets. I needed to see it, to feel the edges of the operation. Late one Tuesday, under the cloak of an overcast sky, I found myself in the desolate parking lot of a small airport customs, late flight. The air, thick with the scent of jet fuel and damp asphalt, pressed in on me. My rental car, a nondescript sedan, was parked far from the terminal, its engine cooling with a metallic sigh. The airport was a skeletal presence under the weak glow of scattered floodlights. My focus, however, was on the cargo area, a cluster of low-slung buildings and vast concrete pads. A single, aging cargo plane, its fuselage scarred by countless journeys, was being unloaded. The hum of its auxiliary power unit was a lonely drone in the night. A forklift, its tines glinting under a distant lamp, moved with practiced efficiency. Several figures, clad in high-visibility vests, worked around the plane. Then I saw it. A white panel van, emblazoned with the familiar understated logo of Global Reach Freight Solutions, pull up directly to the cargo bay. Two men emerged from the van. One, broad-shouldered and brusque, directed the forklift operator with sharp, economical gestures. The other, slender and impeccably dressed despite the late hour, carried a slim attaché case. He didn't participate in the manual labor. He merely observed, his gaze sweeping the scene with an almost proprietary air. My breath hitched as I saw a customs official approach them. This wasn't the usual bustling, bureaucratic exchange. There was no queue, no hurried paperwork. The customs official, a man with a tired slump to his shoulders, exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible nod with the impeccably dressed man. No questions were asked. No manifests meticulously checked. The broad-shouldered man simply pointed to a stack of plain, unmarked wooden crates, and the customs official gave another curt nod, a silent assent. The crates, ordinary in appearance, were loaded onto the Global Reach van with an unsettling haste. The entire exchange took less than 5 minutes. No scanning, no probing, no challenging queries. It was a choreographed ballet of complicity, executed with the practiced ease of countless repetitions. This wasn't an oversight, a lax procedure. This was an arrangement, a well-oiled machine operating in plain sight, protected by the very systems meant to expose it. The crates themselves were nondescript, but the ease with which they passed through official channels was screamingly loud. It wasn't just money they were laundering access. They were moving something tangible, something physical, through the very gates of the nation, with the blessing of a corrupt official. The images, burned into my mind's eye, confirmed my deepest fears. The scale of the operation wasn't just financial, it was logistical, systemic. It had burrowed into the very infrastructure, corrupting the gatekeepers. My skill lay in numbers, in logic, not in confronting men who could so easily subvert the law. Forget this, I ran out of my depth. But then, another image flashed, the senior partner's dismissive glare, the implicit threat. And the numbers, always the numbers, demanding justice. I clenched my jaw, the metallic taste of fear sharp on my tongue. I had seen too much to turn back. The crates, mundane and anonymous, now held the weight of untold secrets. And I, Thomas, the meticulous number cruncher, had just peered behind the curtain of their illicit theater. The curtain was far heavier, and the stage far larger than I had ever dared to imagine. The binders, once a shield of irrefutable fact, now felt like a target strapped to my chest. Yet the numbers, those cold, impartial arbiters, whispered their secrets too insistently for me to turn away. My conscience, a stubborn anchor, held fast against the rising tide of fear. I retreated into the quiet, labyrinthine corners of my own mind, and by extension, my investigation. The firm's network was a fortress, but I knew its forgotten passages. Late nights became my sanctuary, the hum of the servers a lullaby to my clandestine work. I cross-referenced shell companies with shipping manifests, matched bank transfers to obscure offshore accounts, tracing the threads of illicit wealth as it wove through the global financial tapestry. Each link I forged, each anomaly I unearthed, felt like another brick in a wall I was building, both to protect myself and to expose them. I saved everything to an encrypted drive, a digital ghost in the machine, far from the firm's prying eyes. The first tremor of unease was subtle, a discordant note in the symphony of my daily routine. A particular sedan, dark gray and unremarkable, seemed to share my commute for 3 consecutive mornings. Not directly behind me, but always a few cars back, just within the periphery of my rearview mirror. I dismissed it at first as mere coincidence, a trick of the mind wrought by mounting pressure. My work consumed me, blurring the edges of reality. Then came the coffee shop, my usual spot, a quiet nook where I would review my findings before the workday truly began. A tall figure, always in a charcoal overcoat, occupied the same table near the window each day I was there. He never ordered, just nursed a lukewarm cup, his gaze drifting over the street, or so it seemed. One morning, as I gathered my papers, his eyes flickered briefly to meet mine. There was no hostility, no recognition, just a blank, unsettling intensity that lingered after I had gone. It was a glance that felt less like an accident and more like an acknowledgement. My apartment, too, began to feel less like a refuge. A faint scent of unfamiliar cologne, a subtle shift in the angle of a framed photograph on my desk, the quiet click of a floorboard in the dead of night that was not my own weight. I started checking the locks twice, then thrice, before bed. It required a physical document, a customs declaration form filed years ago, that I knew was only accessible through a specific, archaic database at a particular facility. My journey took me to a small airport customs, late flight, a place usually bustling, but now sparsely populated under the cloak of midnight. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile glow on the deserted counters. The air, thick with the smell of stale coffee and forgotten journeys, pressed in on me. I spoke with the grizzled customs officer, a man whose uniform looked as weary as his eyes. He grumbled about the late hour but eventually pointed me towards a dusty archive room, a forgotten corner of the building. He didn't enter, didn't speak. He simply stood there, a silent sentinel, his presence a heavy weight in the quiet room. My breath hitched. This was no coincidence. My heart, a trapped bird, hammered against my ribs. I forced myself to breathe, to appear outwardly calm, even as a tremor ran through my hand. I found the document, copied the relevant details, and made my apologies to the customs officer, exiting the archive with a forced smile. The man in the overcoat was gone, but his impression, sharp and indelible, remained. He had not followed me into the room, had not threatened me directly, but his silent vigil had spoken volumes. It was a deliberate display, a carefully orchestrated moment meant to convey a simple, brutal message. We know where I am, we see what I do. Back in the empty terminal, the few remaining passengers were already boarding the last outbound plane. Was this really happening? Had I imagined the lingering scent, the shifted photograph, the silent watcher? Perhaps the senior partner was right. Perhaps I should just let it go. The millions siphoned, the lives potentially ruined. Fear was a powerful current, but my sense of justice, once a quiet stream, was now a surging river. The driver, obscured by the tinted glass, made no move. It was merely there, a silent sentinel, a punctuation mark at the end of a terrifying sentence. I was no longer merely investigating. I was being watched, hunted even. The game had changed. And I, Thomas, the meticulous accountant, was now irrevocably a player. The chill of the night air, sharp and unforgiving, met me as I stepped from the small airport customs, late flight terminal. The last plane's engines whined into a fading murmur, a metallic sigh against the vast, indifferent sky. My reflection, a ghost in the darkened glass, still haunted me with its pallor, its strained lines. Was this really happening, this slow unraveling of my orderly world? Had I, Thomas, truly stumbled into a labyrinth from which there was no easy exit? The drive home was a blur of streetlights and the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt, each revolution a quiet drumbeat against the frantic pulse in my veins. I clenched the steering wheel, gripped tight. The city, usually a comforting blanket of lights, now felt like a sprawling, indifferent eye watching. I moved through the stillness like a phantom, shedding my coat, my shoes, each movement a conscious effort not to disturb the fragile calm. My wife, a soft silhouette beneath the covers, breathed evenly. I paused at my daughter's doorway, the faint scent of lavender and childhood dreams clinging to the air. Her small form was a mound beneath a dinosaur quilt, utterly oblivious to the storm gathering at our doorstep. Then my eyes, trained to find discrepancies, snagged on something. Not in my daughter's room, nor my wife's, but in the small, sunlit nook where we kept our family photos. A single frame, usually propped against the others, now lay face down. A small detail easily dismissed by another, but to me, a discordant note in the symphony of our home. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the cool glass. The image of my daughter, bright-eyed and laughing, stared back. My wife stirred as I entered our bedroom, his voice a sleepy murmur. "Thomas, I relate, everything all right?" "Just a long flight," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "Anything happened today?" She stretched, a slow, languid movement. "Oh, just a little scare. On the way to pick up our daughter from her art class. The brakes in the car felt spongy, just for a second, then they were fine. Must be the age of the vehicle, I suppose." She gave a soft laugh, pulling the covers closer. "Scared me for a moment, though. Thought I was going to miss the turn." My breath hitched. "Spongy? My car is barely 2 years old. We just had it serviced." "I know, right? But it was fine after that. A fluke. My wife's car was a fortress of reliability, meticulously maintained. My mind, usually a precise instrument, began to connect the disparate threads, the unsettling feeling at the airport, the veiled threats, the subtle disruption in our home, and now a near miss with my family. The air grew thick with unspoken menace. I slipped out of the room, my heart a frantic hummingbird against my ribs. The metallic tang of oil and exhaust filled the air as I approached my wife's car. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I knelt, shining the beam along the underside. I traced them carefully, my forensic eye scanning for any anomaly. And there, tucked away, almost imperceptible, was a glistening, fresh cut. Not severed clean, but a deep, deliberate gash designed to weaken, to fail under pressure, to cause a scare, or perhaps, with a little more time, a catastrophe. This wasn't a fluke. This was a message etched in malice. My gaze drifted to the driver's seat. My daughter's favorite hair clip, shaped like a tiny, iridescent butterfly. It wasn't lost, it was placed. They had been here, they had been in the car, they had been watching. The fear that had been a dull ache, a constant companion, now ignited into something raw and primal. It wasn't for me, not anymore. It was for the quiet breathing in the bedroom, for the small, dreaming form under the dinosaur quilt. They had breached the sanctuary. They had touched the untouchable. The meticulous accountant, the cautious number cruncher, was gone. In his place stood something harder, something forged in the furnace of violated trust and threatened innocence. The labyrinth had become a battlefield, and I, Thomas, would no longer merely navigate its treacherous turns. I would fight. I would expose them. I would protect everything I held dear, no matter the cost. The silence of my home, usually a bomb, felt like a tightening noose. My wife's words, a casual dismissal of a car's sudden malfunction, echoed with a chilling resonance I couldn't shake. A fortress of reliability, she'd called her vehicle, and I knew it to be true. This wasn't a fluke. They were watching, they were close. And now they were touching the edges of my world, the precious, fragile world I had built. Sleep was a distant shore I couldn't reach. To advance alone was to walk into a storm without a compass, a foolish martyr. I couldn't fight this alone. The scale of it, the pervasive reach of the syndicate, demanded more than a single, meticulous accountant. My thoughts drifted to those who had seen the underbelly, those who had tasted the bitter fruit of corporate malfeasance and paid a heavy price. A name surfaced from the forgotten corners of my memory, a ghost from the firm's past, the disgraced compliance officer. Years ago, a quiet removal, a hushed story of insubordination and unethical conduct that had always felt too neat, too conveniently packaged. He had questioned the very structures I was now dissecting, long before I ever sat at my current desk. Perhaps, I thought, his fall was not a failure but a testament to how close he had truly come. Reaching him would be a delicate dance, a clandestine overture. I couldn't use company channels, nor any of my usual contacts. A memory surfaced. The disgraced compliance officer had a peculiar habit, a ritual of sorts. He would fly out on the same late-night flight every few months to visit an ailing relative in a distant city. He preferred the quiet hum of the night, the anonymity of the weary travelers. It was a long shot, a gamble born of desperation, but it was the only thread I had. The air inside the small airport customs late flight was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken goodbyes. My coat felt too heavy, my tie too tight. I was a man playing a role I hadn't rehearsed, my heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had chosen this precise hour, this precise location, for its inherent cloak of anonymity. People were tired, focused on their departures or arrivals, their minds on destinations, not on the quiet man observing the flow. I watched the faces, a parade of strangers, my gaze sharp, searching for a face etched with a familiar weariness, a lingering ghost of corporate battles. And then I saw him. Older now, lines etched deeper around his eyes, but the same fierce intelligence burned there. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, a man who had seen too much and refused to be broken by it. He approached the customs desk, his movements deliberate, unhurried. I waited, a statue of apprehension, until he had cleared the formalities and was heading towards the sparse seating area, a worn carry-on clutched in his hand. "Excuse me," I began, my voice a low murmur, careful not to draw attention. "I believe we worked together many years ago, Thomas." He paused, his eyes, the color of storm clouds, met mine, a flicker of recognition, then a veil of caution dropped. "I remember your name, young man," he said, his voice gravelly, a landscape of past battles. "Though I doubt we ever truly worked together. I was already on my way out when you were just beginning to parse your first ledger." He sat down, leaving a space between us, a silent boundary. "What brings you to this particular purgatory, Thomas?" I've been looking into certain discrepancies." I started, choosing my words with surgical precision, specifically a series of international transactions, shell companies, offshore accounts, the kind of thing that raised red flags for you back then. A humorless smile touched his lips. "Red flags, I remember those. They usually meant a swift end to one's career, didn't they?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Are you suggesting the ghost of my past has finally caught up to your present?" "I think the ghost never left," I countered, my voice gaining a quiet intensity. "It merely changed its haunts. I've found evidence intricate and damning of a money laundering scheme, bigger than anything I've ever seen, and when I tried to bring it to light internally, I was obstructed, warned off. And now," I paused, the memory of my wife's car a bitter taste on my tongue. "They're making it personal." His eyes narrowed, losing some of their cynical edge, replaced by a flicker of something I recognized, a quiet fury. "Personal, you say? The firm always had a way of making things disappear. Problems. A series of numbered accounts, all linked by a single, unusual code, Cerberus Delta. It was hidden deep in the supplementary merger documents, a clause no one would ever look at. I couldn't tie it to anything concrete, but it felt wrong, like a signature. My mind raced, pulling forth a fragment I dismissed as an anomaly. A single, almost imperceptible entry in a subsidiary ledger, years old, marked with that exact code, tucked away in an archive I'd been digging through. It was a transaction that had at the time made no sense, a seemingly innocuous transfer between two unrelated shell companies. But now, paired with his revelation, it sang with meaning. It was the thread, the signature. "I found it too, didn't I?" he observed, a grim satisfaction in his tone. "The firm always claimed it was a legacy code, a relic, but I knew better. It was too specific, too deliberately placed. It meant something. It means they've been doing this for a very long time, Thomas. And it means the roots go deeper than I could possibly imagine. My insubordination was just an early tremor of the earthquake I ran now standing in. The air between us crackled with a new understanding, a shared burden. He wasn't just a cynical observer, he was a wounded veteran, and I, a soldier just entering the fray. The puzzle pieces, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, began to click into place, forming a terrifying picture of an enduring, insidious network. My initial fear began to transform, hardening into a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. I had found my unlikely ally, a man who spoke the same secret language of suspicion and truth. I stood amidst the hushed echoes of the small airport customs, late flight. The air, thin and recycled, carried the metallic tang of distant jet fuel and the faint, sweet scent of duty-free perfume. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a pallid glow on the deserted counters and the single, weary customs agent whose gaze seemed to drift beyond the peeling paint of the ceiling. My heart, a trapped bird, beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had chosen this hour, this isolated nexus, for a reason. The detective's words, whispered in the shadow-drenched alley, had pointed to a specific manifest, a particular cargo arriving under the cloak of night. A package, he'd said, that would either unravel the whole sordid tapestry or tighten its knots around my throat. My eyes, accustomed to the microscopic scrutiny of financial ledgers, now scanned the emptiness with an almost desperate intensity. Every shadow held a potential threat, every creak of the building's tired bones a harbinger. A janitor, pushing a wide, silent mop, seemed to move with an unnatural deliberation, his head perpetually bowed, his figure a smudge against the stark white walls. I noted the brand of his cleaning trolley, a detail my brain, ever the categorizer, stored away. Aero Clean Industrial Series. It was an insignificant detail, yet in this heightened state, nothing felt truly insignificant. Then a reflection in the polished floor caught my eye. A figure standing too still by a closed gate, partially obscured by a pillar. Not waiting for a flight, not saying goodbye, just watching. My breath caught, a shard of ice in my lungs. The customs agent, roused from his reverie, finally called out, his voice raspy with sleep, "Passport, please, sir." I moved towards the counter, my hand already in my jacket pocket, clutching the dummy passport I'd acquired, its paper thin and unfamiliar beneath my fingers. As I reached for it, a sudden, brutal force slammed into my back. My breath exploded from my chest in a strangled gasp. I stumbled, my vision blurring, the sterile lights above morphing into streaking comets. A hand, large and calloused, clamped over my mouth, smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke and something metallic like old coins. "Quiet now." "Accountant," a guttural voice hissed close to my ear, the sound a low rumble of thunder. No need for a scene. My mind, usually so precise, fractured into 1,000 shards of panic and raw instinct. This wasn't a warning, this was the end of the line. The terrifying picture, sketched by the detective, was now painted in vivid, brutal strokes before me. I thrashed, my elbows seeking purchase, my feet scrabbling on the slick floor. The customs agent, startled by the sudden violence, looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief, then fear. He fumbled for something beneath his desk, a movement too slow, too hesitant to be of any use. My attacker, a bulky shadow, tried to drag me towards a dimly lit service exit, a steel door marked with a faded red exit. Another figure emerged from behind the pillar, moving with predatory grace, a phantom in the peripheral glow, 2 against 1, always fight. I twisted, a desperate surge of adrenaline lending me unnatural strength. My heel connected with the bulky man's shin, a grunt of pain, sharp and immediate. The hand over my mouth loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all I needed. I bit down, hard, tasting salt and something foul, a bitter tang of fear and blood. He roared, recoiling, his grip momentarily broken. That was my chance. I ducked under his arm, scrambling away, my eyes darting for an escape route, any path that wasn't towards that steel door. The service exit, the customs counter, a baggage conveyor belt, its black rubber surface a tempting, perilous path. My gaze snagged on a discarded cleaning bucket near the janitor's trolley, a mundane object moments before, now a weapon in my desperate hands. Without thinking, I kicked it, sending it skittering, a rattling projectile, across the gleaming floor, spewing its gray, soapy contents in a wide, treacherous arc. The bulky man, recovering from the bite, slipped, his heavy frame crashing down with a sickening thud, a cascade of curses following him. The second figure, leaner and quicker, lunged, a flash of dull metal in his hand. I ducked again, rolling over a low barrier meant for queuing passengers, its plastic cool and hard against my cheek. My shoulder screamed in protest as I slammed against the ground. As I rolled, my fingers brushed against the lean man's coat pocket. A small, hard object, forgotten in the heat of the chase, perhaps dislodged by his own frantic movements. Instinct, sharp and unthinking, made me snatch it. It felt like a small, cold stone, weighty and significant. I kept moving, scrambling over the conveyor belt, its rubber surface rough beneath my hands, the faint scent of stale baggage clinging to it. The lean man, momentarily thrown off balance by my sudden movement, shouted something in a language I didn't understand, sharp and angry, a guttural snarl that echoed in the vast space. I didn't look back. I burst through a fire exit, the alarm wailing its shrill warning into the desolate night, then sprinted across the tarmac, towards the distant glow of the city lights, the metallic taste of fear coating my tongue. I didn't stop until my legs gave out, collapsing behind a stack of empty cargo containers, my chest heaving, the night air a cruel balm to my raw throat. The alarm from the airport was a fading cry, a distant ghost swallowed by the vast emptiness of the airfield. My fingers, still clenched, slowly uncurled. In my palm lay the object I had snatched, a USB drive, the syndicate's mark. My breath hitched. This wasn't some minor piece of the puzzle. This was it, undeniable. A direct link in my possession torn from the pocket of one of their enforcers, a tangible thread pulled from the very fabric of their clandestine operations. This wasn't just a threat anymore. This was a declaration of war. The world, once a meticulous ledger of debits and credits, had dissolved into a perilous wilderness. There was no going back, no reporting this internally. The system itself was compromised. No safe harbor. I was beyond the pale, an outlaw in a war I never sought, a solitary figure caught in the crosshairs of a monstrous machine. I was truly underground now, with nowhere left to hide but deeper within the labyrinth itself. The bitter taste of iron and something else, something metallic and foul, lingered on my tongue. My jaw ached, a phantom echo of the moment I'd bitten down hard on the fleshy hand. The attacker had recoiled with a guttural cry, his grip dissolving like smoke. That fractional second was my reprieve. I'd twisted, driven by a primal surge, scrambling away from the hulking shadow that had materialized from the alley's deeper gloom. My legs, clumsy with adrenaline, propelled me forward, away from the stench of stale refuse and imminent violence. I didn't look back, the raw panic a drumbeat in my ears, urging me onward, through narrow streets and into the relative anonymity of the city's late-night hum. My destination, decided in a breath, was the small airport customs, late flight. Not escape, not yet. I needed to meet a contact. A whisper of a name passed to me by a terrified junior analyst who had seen too much. A contact who was supposed to have a secure channel, a way to move the irrefutable proof I clutched in my internal drive, the ledger entries, the shell companies, the impossible sums beyond the reach of the firm's corrupt tendrils. My flight, booked under an assumed name, was a desperate gamble, a thread of hope woven into the fabric of my growing fear. The fluorescent glare of the customs hall felt harsh, revealing every tremor in my hands as I presented my passport. The air hung thick with the scent of disinfectant and stale coffee, a sterile counterpoint to the chaos within me. My pulse thrummed a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I scanned the sparse figures, searching for the face I'd only seen in a grainy photo. He met my gaze, a flicker of recognition, a subtle nod. Hope, fragile and fleeting, bloomed. Then a voice, sharp and authoritative, sliced through the quiet. "Mr. Thomas." My head snapped towards the sound. Two customs officers, their uniforms crisp and unyielding, stood before me. Their faces were impassive, their eyes like chips of flint. My heart, which had just dared to hope, now plunged into an icy chasm. This was not the contact. The contact, I noticed, was gone, vanished. This wasn't routine. The way their gazes held mine, the subtle tension in their shoulders, they knew something, or thought they did. A single bare table occupied the center. They asked me to place my carry on it. My fingers fumbled with the clasp, the leather feeling alien beneath my touch. Every movement was scrutinized. "Mr. Thomas, we have reason to believe you are attempting to transport sensitive corporate information in violation of several federal statutes, including corporate espionage and embezzlement." The officer's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet each word was a hammer blow. My mind reeled. "What? That's absurd. I'm a forensic accountant." He ran a practiced hand along the seams, probed the lining. My eyes darted between his methodical movements and the first officer's unblinking stare. Then, a slight pause. A subtle shift in the officer's posture. He reached into a hidden compartment, one I didn't even know existed in my own bag, and pulled out a slim, black USB drive. It wasn't mine. I had a similar one, a standard-issue encryption device from the firm, but this one felt wrong. The texture was slightly different, the weight off. "Is this yours, Mr. Thomas?" he asked, holding it up. "No," I insisted, my voice rising. "I've never seen that before. It's not mine." "Curious," the officer said, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. He inserted it into a portable reader. Screens flickered to life. My stomach clenched. It contains encrypted files, financial records, proprietary data, my digital signature. It was impossible. I had been so careful, so meticulous. I never authorized such a thing. My mind raced, trying to find the flaw, the crack in this perfectly constructed lie. That's a fabrication, I stammered. A setup. I'm investigating a money laundering scheme. I'm the one trying to expose it, not be part of it. The first officer scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. That's a common defense, Mr. Thomas. We have an official communication from your firm detailing your recent erratic behavior and suspicion of unauthorized data access. My own firm. They had been watching me, not because they suspected me of uncovering the truth, but because they were waiting for the opportune moment to ensnare me. The veiled threats, the obstruction, it all coalesced into a horrifying clarity. They hadn't just ignored my warnings, they had weaponized them. The next few hours blurred into a nightmarish sequence of questions, accusations, and my increasingly desperate, unheard denials. I was not formally arrested, but I was detained, my passport confiscated, my flight irrevocably missed. They showed me printouts, screenshots of emails, ostensibly from my account, discussing the sale of proprietary information. Bank statements showing funds flowing into an account bearing my name, an account I had never opened. The digital signature on the transfer authorization. It was all there, damning and irrefutable, yet utterly false. This timestamp. I pointed to a document detailing a communication with an offshore entity. It's from last Tuesday, 3 a.m. I was home, asleep. My system logs would prove it. The officer merely raised an eyebrow. My system logs, Mr. Thomas, appear to have been wiped clean for that period. A convenient oversight, wouldn't I say? My breath hitched. They had not only fabricated evidence, but had also erased my alibi. They had thought of everything. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just a framing, it was an annihilation. The final blow came not from the customs officers, but from a curt, emotionless phone call. My keycard deactivated. My reputation, meticulously built over 2 decades, shattered into a million pieces. We understand this is a difficult time. The senior partner droned, but the evidence is quite compelling. We advise I to cooperate fully with the authorities. There was no offer of legal counsel, no word of support. I was alone, truly, utterly alone. How could I explain it? How could I protect them from the fallout? The contact, my fragile hope, had vanished. The evidence I carried, my real evidence, was now useless, overshadowed by the meticulously crafted deceit. My world, once ordered by numbers and logic, had dissolved into a maelstrom of calculated malice. They hadn't just framed me. They had excised me from my life, leaving me adrift in a sea of suspicion and ruin. This wasn't the end of the game. This was just the beginning of their end game for me. And I had walked right into it. The determination that had fueled me now felt like a fragile flame against a gathering storm, threatening to extinguish me entirely. But even through the despair, a tiny, defiant ember glowed. The knowledge that I was innocent and that somewhere the truth still existed. I just had to find a way to claw my way back to it. The caller's voice, a flat monotone devoid of human warmth, sliced through the already thin air of the small airport customs. Late flight. Thomas, your access to all corporate systems has been revoked, effective immediately. Furthermore, a preliminary audit of your personal finances has revealed irregularities. Your accounts are frozen. The line clicked dead, leaving a hollow echo in the cavern of my chest. My breath hitched, a jagged shard in my throat. The fabricated evidence, the erased alibi, those were blows. This was the earth giving way beneath my feet. They hadn't just framed me, they had annihilated me. My world, meticulously constructed on ledgers and trust, dissolved into a haze of fluorescent light and the acrid tang of disinfectant. The customs officer, a grim sentinel, watched me with an unblinking gaze that saw not a man but a problem. I was a ghost, adrift in a system designed to crush those who dared to disrupt its carefully cultivated rot. A wave of nausea, cold and insistent, washed over me, threatening to drag me into the sterile oblivion of the airport floor. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, spun into a vortex of despair. What was left? Nothing, absolutely nothing. But then, amidst the swirling chaos, a flicker. They had stripped me bare, yes. My career, my reputation, my financial security, even the fragile illusion of my freedom, all gone. But they had not taken my mind. My understanding of their game, their intricate, nefarious dance of numbers, that I still possessed. It was a weapon they hadn't anticipated, a tool they couldn't confiscate. A fierce, desperate resolve began to coalesce, hardening the edges of my despair into something sharper, something dangerous. I was cornered, but a cornered animal bites hardest. I nodded curtly to the customs officer, my voice a rasp. "I understand, thank you." I walked away from the counter, the weight of their fabricated charges a phantom burden on my shoulders. Yet my steps, though heavy, were no longer aimless. My gaze, once clouded, now sharpened, scanning the deserted terminal. My phone, now a worthless brick, went into my pocket. My thoughts, however, were anything but inert. They raced, not in panic, but with the ruthless efficiency of a predator tracking its prey. But in their hubris, they had overlooked the one thing a forensic accountant truly understands: patterns. It wasn't the large transfers that now gripped my mind, nor the labyrinthine network of shell companies I had meticulously charted. It was something far more subtle, a rhythmic signature I had dismissed as noise during my initial analysis, too ethereal to be concrete. Now, with the clarity born of desperation, it shimmered into focus. Their system, designed to be untraceable, had a unique, almost artistic cadence to its operations. The fractional delays between seemingly unrelated accounts, the way certain payments mirrored celestial mechanics rather than market logic, a subtle, almost poetic choreography of illicit movement. It was a financial fingerprint, unique to their command structure, a weakness woven into the very fabric of their perceived perfection. This wasn't just about money laundering anymore. This was about power, about the individuals pulling the strings, not just the money mules or the corporate stooges. The irregularities in my own accounts, the speed with which they had acted, it all pointed to a deeper, more centralized control than I had initially grasped. They weren't just a syndicate, they were a hydra, and I had only been hacking at its tentacles. I needed to strike at its heart. My plan began to form, intricate and audacious, leveraging precisely what they thought they had nullified: my unique ability to read the unspoken language of finance. I couldn't go to the authorities. They were compromised, or I was too thoroughly discredited. I needed to bypass the system entirely. I needed to create an undeniable public record, a financial earthquake that would expose them not just to a few, but to the world. I recalled a specific type of untraceable digital ledger they occasionally used for their most sensitive, highest-value transactions. A ghost in the machine, almost impossible to access without specific encryption keys, or failing that, a profound understanding of its underlying architecture. It was a place where their true identities might be hinted at, obscured by layers of proxies, but still present like a faint scent on a cold wind. If I could access it, and if I could plant a specific traceable anomaly, a digital breadcrumb designed to be ignored by their automated systems but screamingly obvious to a human eye looking for it, then I could turn their own fortress into their tomb. My gaze settled on a dusty, rarely used internet terminal tucked away in a corner near a closed coffee shop. The screen glowed faintly, an anachronism in this era of smartphones. It was perfect, untraceable, public, and most importantly, isolated. I approached the terminal, my fingers tingling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was it, the counter move. I inserted a crumpled bill, the machine whirring to life. My mind, now a finely tuned instrument, began to construct the architecture of my attack. I would not just expose their money, I would expose them. The reveal I sought wasn't a single document, but a pattern, a mathematical anomaly so blatant, yet so subtle, that only another forensic eye would see it for what it truly was: a deliberate, irreversible signature of their guilt. I wasn't just looking for information, I was laying traps, baiting the system. The stakes were impossibly high. One wrong keystroke, one moment of hesitation, and I wouldn't just be framed, I would disappear. But there was no turning back. They had tried to erase me, but they had only forged a weapon. I was no longer defending, I was attacking, and I would use their own numbers to tear them apart. Let them audit that. The cold plastic of the phone still pressed against my ear, even after the flat monotone had ceased, leaving behind only the ghost of its pronouncement. Furthermore, a preliminary audit of your personal finances has revealed. The voice had trailed off, a silent promise of deeper, more insidious trouble. I stood there, a lone, unmoving figure amidst the subdued bustle of the small airport customs. Late flight. The fluorescent lights above hummed with a sterile indifference, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe with my own rising dread. The scent of ozone and stale coffee clung to the air, a mundane counterpoint to the seismic shift that had just occurred in my world. They had moved, swift and brutal, but not, I realized with a grim satisfaction, entirely unexpectedly. My hands, though steady, felt strangely numb. This was it. The precipice. My gaze drifted to the customs officer, a young man with tired eyes, waving through a family laden with oversized luggage. He saw nothing, suspected nothing of the silent war being waged within me. My carefully constructed life, the quiet rhythm of numbers and ledgers, had been shattered. Now only the raw, desperate machinery of survival remained. The audit. That was the unexpected twist, the venomous barb. My personal finances were a fortress of meticulous order, every transaction traceable, every penny accounted for. Had they planted something, fabricated a discrepancy, or had they simply found the subtle, untraceable expenditures I'd made in preparation for this very moment? A pang of doubt, sharp and brief as a knife thrust, pierced my resolve. Had I been too clever or not clever enough? With a deep, measured breath, I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket. My fingers brushed against the small, unassuming USB drive I always carried. My insurance, my last resort. My plan, honed over sleepless nights, was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a living, breathing imperative. I found an isolated bench near a bank of silent departure screens, the destinations flickering in silent invitation. Pulling my worn laptop from my bag, I powered it on, the familiar whirring a comforting, mechanical heartbeat. My fingers, accustomed to the precise dance across a keyboard, moved with an almost surgical deliberation. No corporate network access meant nothing. I had anticipated this. Months ago, I had created a ghost image of the critical data, encrypted it to a degree that would make even the most seasoned cryptographer weep, and then fragmented it across several obscure, seemingly innocuous cloud storage accounts. Accessing them now was a painstaking, multi-layered process, each decryption key a phrase, a memory, a date known only to me. It was a digital breadcrumb trail leading to a hidden feast of truth. The first phase, reconstitution. I watched lines of code scroll, the progress bar inching forward with agonizing slowness. Each kilobyte downloaded, each fragment reassembled, was a tiny victory against the invisible forces arrayed against me. This wasn't merely data. It was the sinews and bones of their empire, the ledger of their corruption laid bare. While the data coalesced, I initiated the second phase, covert communication. My secure burner phone, purchased with untraceable cash and never linked to my identity, vibrated in my palm. I typed a short, coded message, a prearranged signal. It wasn't a question, but a declaration. The curtain falls tonight. I sent it to two numbers. One belonged to the detective, the other to the journalist I had cautiously cultivated over weeks, feeding them just enough to pique their interest without revealing the full, terrifying scope of the truth. They would understand. They would know what came next. Their roles were vital, but their knowledge, for their own safety, had to remain compartmentalized until the very last moment. The air around me seemed to thicken, charged with the silent electricity of impending storm. I imagined the detective, his weary eyes scanning the message, the journalist perhaps in a dimly lit office, a sudden flicker of recognition. They were my anchors, my witnesses. If I fell, they would be the ones to pick up the pieces to finish what I had started. The thought of my family, their faces flashing in my mind's eye, stoked a fire in my belly, burning away the last vestiges of fear. I had to see this through for them. My laptop screen flashed, signaling the completion of the data reconstruction. Now, the trap. I opened a series of pre-drafted emails, each one a meticulously crafted message, accompanied by a compressed, encrypted file containing the damning evidence. These weren't going to just a few individuals. These were going to the world, a global network of investigative journalists, regulatory bodies in multiple countries, even a few well-respected financial blogs known for their tenacity. The sheer volume was meant to overwhelm, to make it impossible to contain. But a direct send was too risky. They would trace it, shut it down. My plan was more insidious. I had built a series of dead man switches, each activated by a specific external trigger. The most crucial one was tied to a public global news feed. If a particular market index dropped below a certain threshold within the next 24 hours, or if a specific political figure made an unexpected public appearance, the system would automatically release the emails. And if I failed to log into a specific innocuous website every 2 hours, the entire cache would detonate. I paused, my finger hovering over the final key. The weight of the moment was immense, crushing. A single keystroke and the dominoes would begin to fall. There would be no turning back, no safe harbor. My life, as I knew it, would cease to exist. The audit, the revoked access, they were merely opening salvos in a war I had, in essence, just declared. A sudden tremor ran through me. What if my calculations were wrong? What if the encryption was compromised? What if one of my numerous fail-safes failed? The intricate web I had woven, designed to protect the truth, suddenly felt fragile, gossamer thin. The syndicate was vast, their reach long, their methods ruthless. Was I truly capable of outmaneuvering them? A forensic accountant, a man of numbers, pitted against a hydra of global crime. But then I remembered the faces of my wife and children, the innocent laughter that echoed in my memory. They were the true numbers that mattered, the only figures I truly cared to protect. My finger descended. Enter. The emails were queued, the dead man switches armed, the global clock ticking. The trap was set. Now I waited for the world to catch fire. The small airport customs, late flight continued its quiet rhythm, oblivious to the inferno I had just unleashed. The stale air of the small airport customs, late flight, clung to me like a shroud woven from recycled oxygen and quiet desperation. Fluorescent tubes hummed a low, persistent lament overhead, casting a pallid glow upon the polished linoleum floor, reflecting the weary faces of the few travelers. Each shadow seemed to lengthen, to twist into the form of a waiting predator. My own breath, a shallow thing in my chest, felt too loud in the hushed space. This was it, the final ledger. My gaze, sharp as a honed blade, swept across the sparse waiting area. A few families, their children already slumped in sleep, a lone business traveler lost in the glow of a tablet screen. And then there they were. The executive, their face a mask of strained composure, a subtle tremor in the hand that clutched a slim leather briefcase. Beside them, 2 others, their suits impeccable, their eyes like polished stones, scanning the periphery with an unsettling vigilance. They weren't just catching a flight. They were shedding a skin, attempting to vanish into the anonymous expanse of the night sky. A tremor, not of fear but of cold resolve, ran through me. I had followed the numbers, a relentless current leading me through a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore accounts, always pointing towards this particular exit point, this specific late flight. The last puzzle piece, a coded message intercepted from a burner phone, had confirmed their desperate dash. They believed they were invisible, their departure cloaked by the hour, their assets neatly packaged for a new beginning across distant shores. They hadn't accounted for the meticulous ghost in their machine. I moved, a phantom amidst the fading echoes of daytime travel towards the customs desk. My heart hammered a rhythm against my ribs, a wild drumbeat, but my steps were deliberate, measured. What if I've miscalculated? What if the net isn't tight enough? What if they simply disappear, leaving me to face the wreckage alone? The thought was a fleeting phantom, banished by the searing image of the threats, the veiled warnings that had haunted my waking hours. There was no turning back. The customs officer, a woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile, looked up as I approached. "Passport, please." Her voice was soft, routine. I offered my document, my gaze still fixed on the executive. They were nearing the gate, their movements a little too swift, a little too anxious. "I believe," I began, my voice a calm counterpoint to the storm within. "There might be an irregularity concerning some passengers on this flight." The officer's brow furrowed, her smile fading. "Sir, if I have a concern with the leather briefcase, their departure is not merely a flight, it's an attempted escape. They carry the final, irrefutable evidence of a vast money laundering operation." Just then, the executive turned. A flicker of recognition, then a sudden horror spread across their features. They knew, they understood the trap had sprung. "We have reason to believe," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "that the briefcase contains encrypted drives. Drives that hold the complete digital ledger, the true face of their illicit empire." My fingers beneath the counter brushed the worn surface of my own phone. A single tap, the final transmission. The data, already partially shared, was now fully unleashed, a flood of truth flowing to the waiting recipients. The detective, the journalist, they had the coordinates, they had the flight number, they had the names. The executive's face contorted into a snarl. One of their associates, a hulking figure, started to move, a predatory glide towards me. "Officer," I urged, my eyes never leaving the executive, "they are about to board. The details of their operation, the names, the routes, the hidden accounts, it's all in that briefcase, and it's also now on its way to my superiors." The customs officer, sensing the sudden shift in the air, the palpable tension, reached for her radio. Before he could speak, a voice, amplified and authoritative, boomed through the quiet terminal. "Attention, passengers on flight 417 to Zurich. We have a brief delay. All passengers, please remain in the gate area." My breath hitched. The detective, they were here. The executive, hearing the announcement, paled. Their eyes darted wildly, searching for an exit that no longer existed. Their presence was a sudden, undeniable weight pressing down on the manufactured calm of the late flight. The executive made a desperate lunge towards the gate, briefcase clutched tight. But the path was blocked. Two officers, their faces grim, moved to intercept. A brief, futile struggle, a desperate twist, and the executive was pinned. The briefcase clattered to the floor, its contents spilling slightly, revealing a glimpse of the sleek black drives within. The other two syndicate members, seeing their leader apprehended, surrendered without a fight, their polished stone eyes now reflecting only defeat. I watched, a quiet observer to the tempest I had unleashed. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to dim, replaced by the crackle of radios, the sharp commands of the officers. The small airport customs, late flight, had become the stage for an unexpected drama, a silent reckoning. The weight on my shoulders, a burden carried for weeks, began to lift, replaced by a profound, weary sense of completion. The syndicate, for now, had flown its last flight. Then figures in the periphery solidified, moving with a controlled urgency that spoke of training and purpose. My breath, previously a ragged whisper, caught in my throat, a knot of pure sensation. The detective, their silhouette now stark against the muted glow of the waiting area, led the charge, their gaze cutting through the thin air like a sharpened blade. Behind them, other shapes equally determined fanned out. The executive, hearing the quiet, authoritative commands that followed, finally understood the net had closed. Their face, already a landscape of fear, drained to an ashen canvas, eyes darting wildly, searching for an exit that no longer existed within the confines of the small airport customs, late flight terminal. The hulking associate, a brute force contained for a moment, froze. The raw aggression that had simmered beneath their skin evaporated, replaced by the sudden chilling reality of a compromised escape. Their posture shifted, the readiness for violence deflating into a slumped acceptance as the first set of hands, firm and unyielding, clamped onto their arms. I watch, a silent observer in my own unfolding drama, as the executive was likewise secured, their protests a pathetic, strangled sound that died quickly in the sterile air. It was not relief, not yet, but the sudden, profound absence of a pressure I had carried for so long it had become part of my very structure. The detective's eyes found mine across the short distance, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, acknowledgement, perhaps, or a shared understanding of the precipice we had all skirted. They offered no smile, no overt gesture, only a steady nod that felt like a quiet anchor in the sudden tempest. The next hours blurred into a tapestry of hushed questions and official pronouncements. I sat numb and detached as statements were taken, details meticulously documented. My testimony, the culmination of months of clandestine work, flowed out in a steady stream, each figure, each date, each transaction a nail hammered into the coffin of their elaborate deception. The numbers, once my tormentors, now became my vindication. Thomas, the detective stated later, their voice low, almost gentle, as we stood by a window overlooking the tarmac, where a lone cargo plane hummed in the pre-dawn gloom. More than clear, you exposed a deep rot, the firm. They're facing a maelstrom. My gaze drifted to the distant lights of the city, a sprawling beast beginning to stir. The firm, my professional sanctuary, now a contaminated zone. The weight of that reality settled on my shoulders, a different kind of burden. I had brought down not just criminals, but an entire institution, or at least exposed its fatal flaw. The prestigious name, the polished facade, would now be synonymous with scandal, with corruption. Was this the cost of truth? I had sought justice, but the collateral damage felt immense, a sweeping tide that would engulf many who were merely bystanders. Word traveled with the speed of wildfire. By morning, the news channels buzzed with the story. Financial giant implicated in global laundering scheme. Read the scrolling headlines. Colleagues, some of whom had scorned my warnings, others who had openly obstructed me, now faced the crushing weight of public scrutiny and internal investigations. The managing partner, their carefully constructed empire crumbling, issued a terse, carefully worded statement, distancing the firm from rogue elements and pledging full cooperation. I knew better. The rot had gone deeper than a few bad apples. The syndicate, a hydra-headed beast, began to lose its heads. Information gleaned from the executive's seized devices, combined with my comprehensive dossiers, led to a cascade of arrests across multiple continents. The money trails, once so carefully obscured, now lay exposed, guiding law enforcement to the hidden coffers and clandestine operations. The elaborate web of shell corporations and offshore accounts unraveled with astonishing speed. The detective called me, a few days later, to confirm that key players, figures I had only known through their coded aliases, and the vast sums they controlled, were apprehended. Yet, a profound weariness clung to me. The adrenaline that had fueled my dangerous odyssey had dissipated, leaving behind an emptiness. My hands, which had once found solace in the precise lines of a spreadsheet, now felt restless, unsure of their purpose. I had saved myself, perhaps, and exposed a great evil, but the transformation had been absolute. I was no longer just Thomas, the meticulous accountant. The world, once a predictable series of numbers and ledgers, had revealed its sharp, dangerous edges, and I was left to navigate its scarred landscape, forever changed by the journey. The victory felt strangely muted, a triumph tinged with the melancholy of what was lost. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of jet fuel and the hushed murmur of late-night travel. My son, a small sentinel, clutched the faded fabric of his stuffed lion, his head nestled against my hip. Beside me, my wife's hand found mine, a quiet anchor in the shifting currents of our new reality. We stood in the hushed, almost reverent space of small airport customs, late flight. a liminal zone where one life ended and another, uncertain, began. The fluorescent glow from above cast long, stark shadows, etching lines of fatigue onto the faces of the customs officers and the few other weary travelers. I felt a phantom weight on my shoulders, the lingering phantom of a briefcase I no longer carried, a ledger I no longer balanced. That firm, once a gleaming monolith of my ambition, now stood as a hollowed shell, its gilded facade crumbled, its inner workings exposed to the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The headlines had screamed, a symphony of corporate betrayal and criminal enterprise, and I, Thomas, had been the reluctant conductor. A quiet cough from the officer at the counter stirred me from my reverie. My documents, crisp and new, were stamped with a decisive thud. No more scrutinizing ledgers for phantom accounts. Now, it was merely the passage of a man, his wife, his son, from one land to another. It felt both impossibly simple and profoundly complex. The truth, when it had finally unspooled, had been a tapestry woven with threads of greed and fear, stretching far beyond the confines of the firm. The international syndicate, a hydra of illicit dealings, had been severed, its head scattered, its roots exposed. The detective, his face a mask of weary triumph, had shaken my hand with a grip that spoke volumes of shared battles. He had called me a hero, a word that felt like a borrowed coat, ill-fitting and unfamiliar. But heroism, I had learned, carried its own peculiar cost. The meticulous accountant, the man who found solace in order and predictability, had been irrevocably altered. He had been forced to become something else, something sharper, more resilient, forged in the crucible of fear and defiance. My son shifted, his eyes wide, taking in the scene. He didn't understand the full weight of what had transpired, only that we were going on a big adventure. His innocence was a fragile, precious thing I vowed to protect with every fiber of my being. My wife squeezed my hand again, her eyes meeting mine. But I also saw an unwavering strength, a quiet resolve that mirrored my own. We had walked through fire. I had seen too much, understood too deeply the mechanisms of corruption that could fester beneath the polished veneer of power. My gaze drifted to the vast windows, where the ink-high blackness of the sky was punctuated by the distant twinkle of departing aircraft. Each light, a promise of a new destination, a different path. The offer had come, quietly, discreetly, from the very authorities I had assisted. Not a return to the front lines, not a life of constant peril, but a role where my unique skill set could be wielded for good. To unravel the tangled threads of financial malfeasance, to expose the hidden networks, but this time, from a position of purpose, not a desperate struggle for survival. It was a new horizon, one I had never envisioned, yet one that now felt strangely, profoundly right. The meticulous nature that had once driven me to perfect balance sheets could now be channeled into safeguarding the very fabric of justice. The air outside the terminal was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and distant pine. A waiting vehicle, understated and anonymous, pulled up. As we settled inside, my son instantly fell asleep, his head on my wife's lap. She leaned against me, a sigh escaping her lips, a sound of release and weary hope. The past months had been a relentless storm, tearing through the carefully constructed edifice of my life. It had left scars, yes, but it had also revealed the bedrock beneath, the strength I never knew I possessed. I had doubted myself, questioned my sanity, and faced down my deepest fears. And in doing so, I had found a new compass, pointing towards a future where my quiet determination could be a force for good. But I was no longer the man who lived by the numbers alone. I was Thomas, forever changed, but with a clear sight, a steady hand, and a heart now beating with a different kind of courage. The journey had been arduous, but it had led us here to this quiet dawn, to a new horizon together.